Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Great friend William Bell right over there. And again, my name is Don K. Preston. Good to have you with us. And William, good to see you again.
Same here. Same here.
Yeah. So, how are things in the big city?
They're going. Just basically taking care of the house situation. I had a big tree limb to fall last week, I think. Yeah, last week. So we had to get that down. But the guy came out and did a real good job, both on the tree and my pocket.
Yeah, well, that's good. Yeah, we had the same thing happen at our house about 3 years ago, a humongous tree. Um, One of our favorite trees in our yard, we had a tremendous storm and the tree looked healthy. It looked vibrant, it looked nice and green. And I mean, it came falling down. Thankfully, it didn't hit a car. It got my neighbor's fence, but they were in the process of selling their property. And I said, "Look, I'll fix the fence." They said, "Nah, we're going to tear the fence down." I said, "Okay."
Yeah, that worked. In that same house, because that was the house I was living in when we met. But in that same
Uh,
house, we had a tree in the backyard that fell on the neighbor's fence, and so I ended up fixing that. And this one fell. It had three limbs on it. One of them was threatening the house, and two of them was leaning toward the street. So one of them did fall across the street. It was about 4 a.m., so nothing, no cars or anything were coming. But I was really concerned that it might fall on the house, and
Boy,
so we got it out of there pretty quickly.
yeah.
Uh,
Well,
really thankful for that.
I walked out to feed the dog night before last, and lo and behold, a great big limb on a mountain cedar immediately behind my house had come crashing down. Thankfully, it didn't hit anything. That's on my agenda this Thanksgiving holiday, to get out with my chainsaw and take care of that and get it all cleared out and what have you. Absolutely love trees, but you just hope that they don't do any damage when the big winds
Tell you,
come. Yeah,
yeah, this was a big oak,
yeah.
so
They
you
they
know
can
how
they can flat do the damage.
I
All
would you
right.
better believe.
Well, I hope you have a big Thanksgiving planned, William. I assume all the family's coming in.
Yeah, they will be hanging out at my house this year. So, and I think they're getting ready now. I know Tarsha came by to pick up some things that Leora had purchased, and so they're getting ready to prepare all of that. Leora's been out in the backyard picking greens, so I'm sure it's going to be pretty big, and all of the rest of the family will be here. So,
No, that sounds like a lot of fun. You be sure to give my love to everybody's.
uh,
Tell them Don says hi.
yeah, I will do that.
I appreciate that. Well, Lance is supposed to come in. We don't get to go to Arkansas and see Danelle and Corey and our grandkids. They have their own doings over there, and they don't know how to come to Ardmore, Oklahoma anymore. They
Really?
Yeah, they've lost the way. They don't know. They don't realize the road still comes down here.
Mhm.
When we talk about, hey, you know what? You guys need to come visit us. And they go, but it's so far down there. And we're going, it's just as far for us to go visit you.
There you go.
And it's not. It's not. It's different. Oh, well, that's the way it is. But anyway, Lance is supposed to come down. Be good to see him. He lives in Oklahoma City, 100 miles away, and we get to see him once every 3 or 4 months, something like that. So
Everybody's within about a 20-mile radius of where I am.
I
So,
started to say all of your kids have always lived just pretty close to you.
yeah, I mean, one of them is just around the block. I mean, so not far at all.
Well, that's good. All right. Well, let's continue our study of the Messianic temple, William. And we've been focusing on the priesthood, because obviously, as we've stated before, priesthood and temple go hand in hand. Uh, Really, you cannot have a restoration of a Jerusalem temple unless you have a restoration of the Levitical priesthood. And so that's why we see in Jerusalem right now, efforts are being made, funded by Zionists, funded by dispensationalists here in America and around the world, to train Levitical priests. even though they don't know who the Levitical priests are. And I don't know why. William, maybe you can explain this to me. How can they justify training priests when they do not know who is a Levitical of the Levitical lineage and who is not? How does that work?
I have no idea. And I'm wondering what the criteria is by which they intend to determine that. What are they going to use to determine it?
I don't know either.
Because from what I've heard, doing DNA traces is outlawed in Israel.
Oh, really? No, see,
Yeah,
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, there have been a few people who have done it. I guess outside of the law that they have there, unless this is something new. But I've seen that several times on YouTube videos where they do not allow them to trace it. And a couple of people who have traced their DNA and gotten their results, they found them not to be from even that area. And that's really interesting. And so maybe that's a little bit of what's behind it. So I'd be curious to find out where that is. I think you and I know I did some correspondence with a gentleman who did those studies a while back, and he had written some things, and I think some studies in the Jewish Encyclopedia or something. I think.
Yeah.
So we've done those studies, but yeah, that's part of the problem. So I'm really, really interested in what's going to show up and how they're going to make that determination.
Yeah, let's go back and touch on some of the things that you mentioned there. In the Britannica Encyclopedia, in the Jewish Encyclopedia, in the American Encyclopedia, and basically any of your major encyclopedias, when they talk about what is a Jew, they just simply say a Jew is someone who practices the Jewish religion, has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with lineage. Well, who's an Israelite? Well, that theoretically, let me emphasize that point, is someone who is of the lineage of Abraham. But then they openly say, I mean, any of the sources that I just mentioned, those encyclopedias, every single one of them say the idea that there exists today a homogeneous people descended from Abraham is a myth and a fable with no scientific proof. Now, I know, William, you know this. When you say things like this, oh, you're anti-Semitic. They jump up and down. Oh, wait a minute. If it's a fact, it's a fact. That doesn't mean that we have any ill feeling toward anybody. But it's just like me saying, Brother Bill, I feel like, and I'm going to identify as the long lost son of Bill Gates. And you say, Preston, get real. You are not a son of Bill Gates. Well, that would make you a hater. You hate me. No, it's just a fact. And that's perfectly analogous when people who have done the anthropological studies, when they have done the historical studies, and they just state the facts. There is no nation descended from Abraham by blood today. And when I have shared those quotes, I have been the object of vitriol. I've been the object of hatred. And one of the responses that I have made to that is, well, when Jesus said the temple at Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, not one stone left standing on top of another, he was building on the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Zephaniah, Haggai, etc. So were those Old Testament prophets anti-Semitic when they predicted the fall of Jerusalem that was going to happen in AD 70? Was Jesus himself anti-Semitic? Did he hate the Jewish nation? I mean, people can get so, how to express this, how emotionally wrapped up into an ideology that they don't even think rationally. I mean, is that not an accurate description?
Yeah, most certainly. I listened to a guy today. I was just passing, on Facebook, and I just said, okay, let me listen to this guy. It was something about the end time and Ezekiel, and I can't remember the preacher's name, but man, did he go in hard on people who rejected Israel as a nation and people, et cetera. And of course, he talked about all of the dispensational concepts that that people have, but he went in pretty hard, and I think he made some illustration. I really don't recall it. I wish I was trying to sit here as you were talking and remember that, but he was saying basically that you know being a anti-Zionist, I don't know what he called it, but it was something really despicable
Mm.
in terms of the way he was referring to it. And but yeah, it gets people all worked up and just vehemently antagonistic about your disagreeing with them concerning those things.
Yeah. And as I was sharing with someone, or they shared with me, and it's something I knew and there's a very, very active movement in America among, quote, American Jews who are anti-Zionist.
Oh yes.
I mean, in Los Angeles, I think that's the headquarters of one of the movements, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, they're just vehement. They just say these Zionists are not true Jews. They are not true Israelites because they say Israel's not supposed to be there without God's blessing, and God's not going to bless what they're doing over there right now.
Yeah, well, I interviewed
Yes, that's
David
right.
David Weiss some years ago, and I think there is that Nakura Kata or something like that. It's some name that they were associated
I've
with. I can't
forgotten it.
remember
Yeah.
exactly the name, but he gave me four things, and I never can remember all of them. But in that interview that I did with him, he said there are four reasons
Hmm.
why they reject them, and he said one is they could not go back into the land unless they were led by the Messiah.
Right.
Well,
That's
that's
one
going to
of
be a long wait. Secondly, he said,
hmm,
in all the nations where we are scattered, we are supposed to be at peace with them. And he based that on Jeremiah.
hmm.
And he also said they were not to engage in military warfare
Right.
in
I
order to
remember
go
that.
back into the land. Yeah.
Right.
So, and the fourth one, I don't remember.
If I remember correctly, the fourth one was that they had to be Torah observant, and they
Okay.
are not.
Okay.
They're absolutely not Torah observant.
So, with that, just looking at that list of four things that they mentioned, and those are the reasons why they oppose them. Um, it's the contrast between what he was saying and what you see
Yeah.
going on with them. It's just, you know, as different as night and day.
And you made the statement, and I agree. That's what we started out by saying is how do they justify trying to train priests for this supposed millennial temple in reality, which will be the man of sin's temple? I mean, I'm sorry, that's just, at least in the dispensational paradigm that's the way it is. Well, I asked my friend in Israel, Reuben Broner is his name. I have mentioned it many, many times. He and I correspond very often. He's living in the part of Israel that has not experienced all of the rockets and what have you, thankfully. They hear the booms, they hear the rockets every once in a while, but they haven't been hit by them directly. But nonetheless, I believe it was early part of this year. Maybe it was last year. I lose track of time so easily anymore. Uh, but I asked her, pardon me, I asked Reuben, in regard to the training of the priest, they have to be Levites. So I said, since the genealogies do not exist, how can they know who is qualified to be a priest and who is not Levitically? And his candor and honesty just honestly, it kind of knocked me back a little bit. He said, we don't have any way of knowing. And he said, essentially the position is and this gets back to me saying, I believe I'm going to identify as Bill Gates' long lost son. He said, essentially, what we do is if anyone claims to be a Levite, we just take his word for it. Yeah. And I was like, what? I mean, if that's not a loose, uh, do what you want to do, be what you want to be attitude, how could anybody give serious thought to the idea that these men, just because they sort of kind of think they're Levites, they're going to be appointed as Levites, to think that they would be qualified to serve at any proposed temple? Who could trust this type of thing?
And when you look at some of the studies that talk about the lineage of priests,
Oh,
they went back several generations to confirm that they were a part of the priesthood, that they were, legitimate in terms of their ancestry. And to have them just be that loose about it should really raise some red flags for a lot of people. And yet these people it's almost like a drunken stupor
yeah.
in terms of their fanaticism about this being Israel. And, they're willing to fight, kill, and everything else to support that and give them all their money as well.
And let's illustrate that. In Ezra, of course, written after the return from the Babylonian captivity, they're in the process of building the temple. They have to have priests to minister at the temple. Well, Ezra chapter 2, 62 and following tells us that there was a group of men. I can't even begin to remember how to pronounce their names. There's some of those names that you almost wonder, why would any mother name their kid that? So, anyway, there are 3 or 4 men, as I remember it, who wanted to be priests, William. And it says a search was made of the records, and when no record was found to support their claim, they were rejected.
Yes.
Okay, now that was long, long, long before the time in which there were no genealogical records. They had the records available, which really effectively proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the genealogical records were not destroyed in 586 BC. But so far as I know, every historian recognizes there are no Jewish sources that deny this that I'm aware of. Everybody admits all genealogical records were destroyed in AD 70. So if back there in the time of Ezra, they looked at the genealogical records and they said, dudes, guess what? We can't find your name anywhere. We can't find your father. We can't find your grandfather. We can't find your great, 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 great grandfather. So guess what? You are not a Levite. You're not serving as priest. So all of them were excluded. To me, that really, really, really drives home what we're talking about here, about how loose it is in modern day Israel when they're supposedly training men to be Levites. Who are these people?
I mean, today with DNA studies, they should be able to trace that back. At least I would think. What are your thoughts on doing those traces?
I have ambivalent feelings about this, William. I really do. First of all, in order to do a legitimate DNA test on person Z over here, you have to know without a shadow of a doubt who person A is, right?
You at least have to have a starting point for sure.
And that's my point. You have to have a known, verifiable, confirmed starting point. If 100 generations from now, someone jumped up, for whatever reason, why they would do it, I couldn't tell, said, I'm a descendant of Don K. Preston, and I want to run a DNA test. They would have to be able to have some verifiable DNA from Don K. Preston living in 2024 in order to run his DNA test and say, you know what, guess what? He is a whatever generation descendant of Don K. Preston. So my question is, where do they find the verifiable source of Abraham's seed?
Okay, let me interject something here.
Okay.
All right, there's more than one variable that uh, can be looked at for that. One, they can do sort of a location study in terms of the people in a particular geographical study, in terms of people in a certain geographical area, and then look at the DNA of people who come from that particular area. Now, I do understand people move about, etc., but at the same time, everybody hasn't necessarily left, from where they were, because there's information out there that some of the people who can trace their original lineage back are still living there. Another thing is, and this is some of the information, and you remember this scientist by the name of Eran Elhaik, I think is his name? Eliak. Okay. All right. Well, at any rate, thanks for correcting that pronunciation, because I never did know how to pronounce his name. At any rate, some of the studies that he did showed that the DNA that some of these people who are claiming to be Israel has is from an area of Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
And it is consistent with the studies, and the evidence that they found today. So they can look and see basically from a basic area and compare that with the DNA of people in another area and say, okay, there's a link. And what they have not found was a link of those same people in that area of Palestine, but yet they can find DNA of people in Palestine in other places.
Right.
So that's another way to look at that from that perspective, by sort of combining certain elements. And then the third one would be the linguistics of it, or the language.
Mm-hmm.
And from studies that I've done, the languages that were spoken by the people in that area, they all were Semitic languages. And when we talk about Semites and descendants of Shem, it's more than just the biology of it.
Yeah.
It was also the linguistic aspect of it. In other words, all of these people spoke Semitic languages. Well, when they traced the language of those people who came from that area and where they recently came from, it's not a Semitic language at all.
Yeah.
So that becomes another telling issue from that perspective.
Yeah, and I don't claim by any stretch of the imagination to be any kind of an expert on this. These are questions that I have that are troubling to me when people say, well, DNA proves this or DNA proves that, and I'm aware of the geographical studies. For instance, several studies have been made concerning people in Ethiopia saying, oh, well, this proves there are the 10 tribes. Well, that to me has been troublesome. They are far, far removed. Could they be of the diaspora? Well, it's possible. They have a long-standing tradition. So, yeah, there are many, many variables that are worthwhile looking into. But all of that aside, they still don't have the genealogies to confirm a Zadokite or a Levitical priesthood.
Yeah.
And obviously that's my entire point. And I am really dubious of DNA studies. It's an area that I keep promising myself I'm going to dig deeper into. And some of the things that you raised, like I said, I'm aware of those issues. I'm aware of linguistics. I'm aware of geography. I'm aware of culture and what have you. I just have all sorts of questions about it. Okay. And I know in some of these areas you've done far more study, and so I would certainly defer to you in some of those studies and let you enlighten me in some of those areas as well, because like I said, I just simply haven't dug into it quite as much as I know that you have. I've read several DNA studies, conflicting studies that, one say, well, it's Ashkenazi and it's this, and others say, no, no, it's not Ashkenazi. And there's been all sorts of controversy in Israel just over the last 20 years about this entire issue. And some long-standing studies have been really challenged in regard to the Ashkenazi claims and what have you. So all that aside, don't want to get too far afield in our examination of this priesthood issue of having to have a properly appointed, properly purified, properly accredited priesthood in order to serve at a temple. Now, William, there's another issue here that goes back into what we would call the Maccabean era as well. And it raises the question of how it might affect a priesthood of today. Under the time, or in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, in approximately 174 BC, Antiochus sent his emissaries into Jerusalem, and they conquered the city. They defiled the altar, and that began the Maccabean revolt. Well, actually, it had started before that, but nonetheless, he conquered the city, desecrated the temple. Well, during this period of time, there was a high priest who was known as Onias. Some call him the third, some identify him as the fourth. I don't know which he is, but I'll just simply call him Onias. He was recognized as a righteous, ordained, holy man of God, highly, highly respected. Well, there were a couple of men who were actually somewhat related to one another by the name of Jason and Menelaus. Jason wanted to be high priest because of the money involved. So he goes to Antiochus Epiphanes and says, make me high priest, and I'll pay you X amount of money. Antiochus was always after money because he was always at war and it cost a lot of money. So he said, okay, sure, you're high priest. So he deposed Onias. Well, Menelaus recognized, hey, if somebody can buy the office of high priest, I'll go to Antiochus and I'll outbid Jason. So he goes to Antiochus and he says, high bid. And Antiochus says, you're the man. And he deposes Jason. Well, in the meantime, Onias fled to Egypt. And he took refuge in a city down there. And Jason and Menelaus knew that if Onias decided to raise an army to come back and retake the priesthood, they were in a lot of trouble. So they conspired to kill him. And they sent a man, if I'm not mistaken, the man's name was Andronicus. Andronicus went down to Egypt and through subtlety convinced Onias that he was a man of peace. He just wanted to talk. He just wanted to make everything right. So when Onias came out, they killed him. Now, this was at the directions of Menelaus and Jason. According to Reuven Bronner and other sources that I have actually read, this automatically disqualified either Jason or Menelaus from being high priest because now they're guilty of shedding innocent blood. Mm-hmm. They're guilty of bribery. They were evidently guilty of immorality as well. They were evidently some pretty raunchy individuals. Is it not your understanding, William, that beginning with that period of time onward, that the high priesthood in Israel was corrupted?
Oh,
and,
yeah.
And was not really divine and holy and righteous?
Well, that would be the general idea. and result of that situation. You know, I've read some of that even in Josephus' history as well.
Yeah. And we come to the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community.
Mhm.
One of the very reasons that the Essenes began their community was the corruption of the priesthood in Jerusalem.
Right.
So it really makes you wonder if the priesthood was that corrupted, even in the time of Jesus. Here we are 2,000 years later. What would be the hope? What would be the expectation of having duly qualified holy men serving as priests, especially since they cannot prove they are in fact Levites? Does that long history of a corrupted priesthood not come to bear on this entire issue?
Yeah, I would think it does because, you know, again, if you were trying to trace that line or trace through them, you know, you're going to have something that starts out being corrupt. And so the end result is not going to be a genuine result, you know, once you're done.
Yeah, and that's my whole point. I mean, and somebody may jump up and say, "Well, look, what if they've got a man in Jerusalem now that is a righteous man? He's an humble man. He's a student of Torah. He's this and that and the other." And well, number one, he can't trace himself genealogically to Onias, but even if he did trace himself to Jason and Menelaus, so what? They're corrupt. They were not properly accredited high priests. So it seems to me like there are an awful lot of elements that you throw into this stew to talk about the priesthood of any proposed messianic temple, and the chief among them being the priesthood. I remember some years ago, you may remember this better than me, William. I remember Max giving a lesson on the centrality and the significance and the importance of the priesthood. And he said something to the effect, everything revolves around priesthood. Do you remember that lesson?
You know, Max did several, he did a whole year worth of living presence articles on the priesthood. But yeah, I do remember vaguely, not specifically, but I do remember his emphasis on everything centering around the priesthood. And I don't know whether I got that from him or not. You know, sometimes you sit in those seminars and you learn things by osmosis. You find yourself repeating or
Yeah.
saying something, and you know you're not sure. Did you come up with the idea, or did someone else come up with the idea? But I've often said it. You know, just based on looking at Hebrews 7, 11, and 12. You know,
Yeah.
I've always said, you know, everything rests on the priesthood. And so again, I'm not sure if that came from Max's influence or just reading the text, but I do remember him saying that. And like I said, that I remember even people talking about that series, that was one of the most significant and interesting and informative studies that they had, you know, read about during that series when we were publishing there. He got a lot of positive feedback from people and even scholars, you know, other scholars on that piece that he did on the priesthood.
And it's just like you said, all you have to do is read Hebrews chapter 7, 11, and following. And it's something that people don't normally give an awful lot of thought to, but the priesthood came first and then the law.
Mm-hmm.
By the priesthood, the law was given.
Yes.
And that's some pretty dynamite stuff, really, when you think about it. Because we normally think about, well, okay, God gave the law at Sinai. And there's some commentators who take the position and they say, well, this doesn't mean that God gave the law to the priest and then the priest delivered it to the people, but it means that the priest stood in the place of delivering the law once the law had been given. I'm not sure about that position. The language itself of Hebrews chapter 7, verse 11, seems to indicate that the law flowed from the priesthood because God gave it to the priest. And of course, we know that Moses himself was a priest, and that may be what is involved in that statement. You know, I think it's Psalms 99, verse 6, if I'm not mistaken, identifies Moses as a priest and a prophet. So, anyway, well, last week And that's enough on that, perhaps. Is there anything else you'd like to throw in there insofar as any qualifications of any modern priesthood in any proposed modern temple?
I know that pretty much, I think, covers it quite well.
All right. Well, last week we looked at verse 22 of Hebrews chapter 7 by how much more Jesus has become the surety of a new covenant, and we covered that, I think, sufficiently last week. Now, I want to look at verse 24 because a question is often asked me, William, and I know you've been asked this question before. But he, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. The question is asked very commonly, well, okay, since Christ has come, do we need him as our high priest, as our mediator, and as our intercessor? So how would you address that, William?
Well, those statements that we have in the scriptures that talk about that point beyond 70 AD, that emphasize that piercing into the age, that going on, as the text would render it, forever and ever. And as you say here, because he continues forever, he has an unchangeable priesthood. I just cannot see that being limited up to the time of 70 AD.
Yeah.
How do you make that the forever? And so, in my understanding, that would continue, unchanged, forever, world without end, from that perspective. And those are the passages that really, really, to me, are not sufficiently addressed when you talk about, what happened in 70 AD, or trying to limit everything to that point, because of these passages. And so I see that as exactly as it says, an unchangeable priesthood, because he continues forever. And in the text, it's a contrast between those who would not.
Right.
They died. They had to, it had to change all the time. But here's a situation where he lives forever. And so what are you going to do? You're going to kill him to end it? I mean, that's how theirs ended.
Yeah.
I can't see it otherwise at this
Well,
point.
yeah, and it seems to me that one of the reasons why people get hung up on this is because it's a carryover from futurism.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the futurist paradigm, as you well know, the belief is that, at the coming of the Lord, guess what? There's no more sin. There's no more death. There's no more temptation. There's no more evangelism. Well, if there's no more sin, then guess what? We don't need a mediator. We don't need to pray to the Lord for forgiveness. And of course, another aspect of the question is, well, okay, grant that aside. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus Christ continually cleanses us. Since Christ's blood continually cleanses us, we don't need to ask for forgiveness. Therefore, we don't need him as a mediator. We don't need him as an intercessor. And yet here is the passage, nonetheless, that see, he ever lives to make intercession for us. So if the text says, as it clearly does, that Christ ever lives to make intercession, then guess what? The idea of a time coming when we don't need intercession is inherently false.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I've always approached this text. And furthermore, the basic assumption of the futurist is that, okay, after the coming of the Lord, there is no more sin, therefore there is no more need for evangelism, flies in the face of Isaiah chapter 66 that says, after the day of the Lord, the survivors of the day of the Lord would go to the nations who had never known the Lord, who had never called on the name of the Lord, never served the Lord, to bring them to Zion to serve the Lord. That's nothing but evangelism.
That's correct.
And so there's so many false concepts in the futurist view that bleed over and that people bring as luggage, as I'll call it that. They bring their luggage of futurism into full preterism, and they say, well, wait a minute. Okay, the Lord has come, and there's no more sin, there's no more death, there's no more curse. That means I don't need Christ. Well, then how are you going to deal with the text that says he ever lives? By the way, there's another point to shift gears here a little bit. Uh, William, I know that you've interacted with Mormons to a certain extent. I used to deal with them on a very, very regular basis in Shawnee, Oklahoma. Uh, the house where I lived was literally 2.5 blocks from a Mormon assembly house. And they would have their weekly meetings and go from there and just saturate the community. Well, okay, I invited them in naturally. And I made them promise. I said, okay, well, listen to me now. I said, I will agree to study with you if you'll agree to study with me for 6 weeks without bailing on me. Well, of course, we'll be glad to do that. This is great, wonderful. We'll be glad to study with you for 6 weeks. I said, now, do I have your word? Oh, absolutely. I said, okay, that's great. I said, I want to talk about the priesthood. So I went right here to Hebrews chapter 7, verse 24. The word that says Christ's priesthood is unchangeable is aparabatos. And it literally means, pardon me, non-transferable. Well, guess what is part and parcel of the Mormon doctrine? Well, Joseph Smith supposedly received the Melchizedekian priesthood from an angel. Huh. Christ's priesthood, the Melchizedekian priesthood, is non-transferable. And these young men, these elders, literally did not know what to say. And this was about the third week into our study. And they looked at it and looked at it and looked at it. And they said, well, we've never heard that before, so we'll have to go back and we'll have to talk to our elders about that. I said, okay, that's fine. So I said, now the next week, I want an answer to this. And they said, oh, we'll give you an answer. It'll be the right answer. And I said, okay, that's fine. I said, but you got to understand, Christ cannot give the Melchizedekian priesthood to anyone. It's untransferable. Well, we don't know the answer. Okay, so they came back next week and they sat down at the table. They said, now tonight we want to study the following subject. I said, time out, time out. I said, guys, don't you remember what we talked about last week? And they sat there with this puzzled look on their face and they said, no, we don't. What was that? I said, the priesthood of Christ being non-transferable. And they said, no, we don't remember studying that. And I said, guys, don't do this. I said, very good and well, we talked about it the whole study. You said you did not have an answer. You said you were going to ask your stake leader about this word, aparabatos, non-transferable. Jesus's priesthood, the Melchizedekian priesthood, can never be given to anyone else. You say an angel gave it to Joseph Smith. That cannot be true. It is false. Therefore, Joseph Smith's priesthood is itself false, and that means your priesthood is false. I said, now you promised to give me an answer. Give me an answer. And they said, yeah, now we remember. And they said, well, you're right on that, but let's go over and study this other subject. I said, no, we're not going to study another subject. I said, fellas, let me tell you something. You just surrendered your religion. So I went over it all over again. And they said, well, if you are going to insist on studying that and presenting that, we're just going to have to say that this study is over because obviously you don't have an open mind. So they got up and left.
Wow. I'm not surprised.
That was about the fourth week into the study.
Yeah.
But that's the power. Number one, that's the power of Jesus as Melchizedekian priesthood. No one else can have it. And it cannot be given to anyone else. Cannot be transferred by an angel. Cannot be transferred by any man. No one can take it from him. It belongs to Jesus and Jesus alone. That is so incredibly powerful. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it is powerful, and the example that you gave from that experience that you had with those Mormons is very telling. Uh, when you look at uh, the priesthood and you think about it being, non-transferable, I think it is also centered in the fact of what Christ did in order to be, uh, designated and crowned as high priest. His work on the cross, no one else could have done that. And because of that work, he's entitled to, being the high priest. And of course, being a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, of course, it becomes non-transferable from that perspective. So no one else deserves that honor. That was an honor bestowed. And who else would have even come near to qualifying in order to have such an honor bestowed on them as far as that goes?
Amen. Absolutely. Amen. Well, I just wanted to go over that because to me, when we encounter these young men who are honestly devout, but they're grossly misled, grossly indoctrinated, they simply do not have the truth concerning the priesthood of Christ. And let's face it, folks, if you've had any experience with the Mormon religion, and for several years, I was just immersed in a study of Mormonism and the reason for it is because they were passing by my door, virtually every week. And I mentioned that I lived there and that they would come to my door so often. After that exchange with them, I would literally stand at my front door to look for them. And they would cross the street at the house across the street. They would wave at me like, "Hi, Mr. Preston." They would, and I would go, "Come here, come here." And they said, "No, that's fine. We can't do that." They would never study with me again. And again, that shows you the power of this text. They knew the power of this text. And so, anyway, that for those who might encounter the Mormons, the entire house of Mormonism is based upon the doctrine of the priesthood of Joseph Smith. He supposedly had the Melchizedekan priesthood. But let me repeat what I've already said twice. Joseph Smith could not have the Melchizedekan priesthood because Jesus could never give it to anyone else. He could not share it and it could not be transferred. That means Joseph Smith was a false priest and a false prophet as well.
Yeah. And it would have put him back into the same category as Levitical priest as far as his life was concerned, because he certainly didn't live forever from that perspective. So now we're right back to priesthood that couldn't continue because they.
That's exactly right. Powerful, powerful point. Okay, notice verse 25 starts with therefore. And if you remember George Bailey years and years ago, William, George Bailey used to say, anytime you see the word therefore, look to see what it's there for. And that's a really good little axiom. Therefore what? Because Christ has a priesthood that continues forever and that is non-transferable. He is able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession. Now, maybe, William, for just a moment here, we don't need to go into this in depth. Is there a difference between making intercession and being a mediator?
There's probably a slight difference from that. A mediator, of course, is a person who goes between, two parties that are at variance, and he may not necessarily be interceding on behalf of one. The mediator may be sort of the independent voice, if you please, between the two to listen and to try to bring about some type of reconciliation or allow them to do so in the process. Whereas an intercessor, from what I would understand as a slightly different concept, is a person who is definitely on behalf of the people who need interceding, who need the intercession, and therefore would be working directly in their favor and on their behalf to bring about this need or change or whatever desire that they may have.
Well, that's exactly what I understand from the difference between a mediator and an intercessor. And this brings us right back to the subject. Well, do we still need Christ today? Well, he ever lives to make intercession for us. So if he always lives, never dies, his priesthood never ends, but it is an intercessory prayer, then that says that man will always have a need for someone to plead our case for us. And he can do that because he was tempted in all points like we are, yet without sin. So Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, understands everything about us as human beings. He understands our foibles. He understands our weaknesses. He understands our desires. And he can plead our cause to the Father. You know, it's just like John said, 1 John chapter 2. If any man sin, we have an intercessor. One who pleads our case. The Paraclete, who is a defense lawyer, to put it, is the way that I've heard it by different Greek scholars at different times. We have a defense lawyer who's never lost a case, to put it that way, to plead our cause when we call upon him as our intercessor. And he mediates for us because he has already given the Father's case to us. He has revealed the Father to us. And now he goes between the Father and us, mediating the cause on both parties. Do you think that's a fair way of putting that?
Yes, definitely.
All right. Well, this final statement here, well, a couple of verses after it, but nonetheless, for such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens. We'll save the rest of it until next week, perhaps. But William, we've said this before. Don't you suppose that verse 26 would resonate with the Jewish readers or listeners who had been in and around Jerusalem, in and around the Jewish temple? They were conversant with, they were extremely knowledgeable of the corruption of the high priest. You know, they're always had their hand out for bribes, always had their hand out for money. They were always looking for vulnerable women. They were corrupt. They were not holy. They were not harmless. I mean, that's real evident. Holy, harmless, undefiled. Now, I'm told, maybe I need to do a little bit more study on this, but is it your understanding that the word defiled here carries with it the connotation of sexual defilement of someone? In other words, they have not been touched. They're not guilty of fornication or adultery. And again, the Jerusalem priest at the time of Jesus in the first century, it was evidently a cesspool. I mean, it was just rampantly corrupt. So is that your understanding of undefiled?
Well, I hadn't looked at the term from that perspective. I was always under the impression that it would have to do with some defilement related to the law. Excuse me. You know, as you look in the Old Testament, and you see, you know, defilement in terms of dead bodies and things of that nature. So that's been the context. So I haven't studied the word from that particular perspective, even though when you, as you were indicating, when you go back and you study, you know, the house of Eli and you see what happened with his sons, et cetera. And then some of these priests that you were talking about, even, you know, when you talk about Caiaphas and Annas, et cetera, and, you know, you could see certainly, you know, corruption involved in the priesthood with them as well. So I'd have to go back and look at it and pick up that connotation as well.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that it had strictly and solely to do with sexual immorality, because as you pointed out, it's defilement under the law. Leviticus is a book about defilement when you get right
Yes.
down to it. I mean, if you touch a dead animal, if you touch a dead body, you can't have sexual relations with your wife during her menstrual period. When you go out and relieve your
Leprosy.
leprosy, I mean, just about a gazillion different things pardon me, could defile a man and disqualify him from being a priest. And that's why, by the way, folks, as the Day of Atonement approached, the high priest literally went into quarantine. I mean, they took him into the temple, pardon me, and they kept him alone in the temple in a special room in the temple. And then his substitute was likewise kept separate from him in a separate place in the temple. And they went through this entire ritualistic purification every single day. And if memory serves me correctly, it's either 14 days or a week. It's been a while since I studied this. Either 14 days or a week prior to Yom Kippur, every single day he went through all of these purification rites, these washings and oblations, just to make absolutely sure that, well, maybe during the night, an unclean bug might have might have slipped or crept into the room. Something might have happened. And so all of these purification rites to prevent him from being defiled. And they always had these backups just in case. So the Jews had this incredible system of defiling actions, defiling objects, just on and on it went. And so when it comes down to, we have a high priest who is undefiled, that carried with it such an incredibly wonderful, and to the first century Jews familiar with the Jewish temple and the priesthood there, almost a shocking revelation and a shocking contrast between the priests that they knew and their corruption and their defilement and their abuse of Torah, and this one named Jesus that had walked among them, talked among them, challenged them. Which of you finds fault without guilt? Let him throw the first stone. They all left. They could not find fault with Jesus. So this is an incredible text, given the historical, cultural, religious context of the priesthood at Jerusalem and its corruption, and how far above them Jesus was, how attractive, how appealing, how wonderful that was to consider Jesus as this kind of a high priest. Your thoughts on that before we go on?
Yeah. Oh, well, that was, very well said. And it's very clear, the statements again, which of you convicts me of sin? None of them could do it. They would all turn and go away. Just a beautiful life lived. And the Bible says, he went about doing good. And so there was nothing that they could bring against him that would indicate, any defilement whatsoever. Even though they made charges against him, but those charges were none that, could stick in terms of the things that he did and the things that he said. So it was definitely a great contrast between who they were and the things that they did. Compared to that distinction. My phone is going off here.
Uh-oh. Well, listen, maybe that's the buzzer. Maybe that's our timer, because according to my timer, we're out of time, William.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah,
good
that's what it
timing.
was.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us this evening, ladies and gentlemen, on Two Guys in the Bible here. Pardon me, on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. I hope you're enjoying our study as we dive into Hebrews here, and what it says about the temple, what it says about the priesthood and the temple and the services there. And as we look to the very nature of the Messianic temple and Jesus as that high priest, such a beautiful picture of Christ and a beautiful picture of the true tabernacle which God pitched and not man. With that, I'm going to say good night and God bless. Thank you, William, for being with me.
To be here.